The harsh crack of a gunshot split the evening air, causing Harriet Lawson to flinch and duck behind the rain barrel at the edge of town. It wasn't the first time gunfire had erupted in Whispering Creek, but it was the first time she'd been caught so close to the action. Tucking herself smaller against the wooden slats, she pulled her worn shawl tighter around her slender shoulders and prayed no one would notice her. In 1875, the Western Territories were no place for a woman alone, especially one who couldn't even speak up to defend herself. Harriet had arrived in Whispering Creek just 3 days ago, summoned by her ailing aunt who ran the town's only millinery shop. The stagecoach journey from Boston had been arduous, leaving her exhausted and more withdrawn than usual. Not that Harriet had ever been what folks called outgoing. Words had always stuck in her throat like molasses in winter, especially around strangers. Her mother had called it pathological shyness, though the fancy doctor in Boston had used more complicated terms about selective mutism and acute social anxiety. Whatever it was called, it had followed her west like an unwanted shadow. Another shot rang out, followed by the sound of breaking glass and men shouting. Harriet squeezed her eyes shut, wishing she could disappear entirely. Her heart hammered against her ribs as heavy footsteps approached her hiding spot. Well now, what do we have here? Harriet's eyes flew open to find a man's boots inches from her skirts. Her gaze traveled upward past dust-covered denim, a worn leather gun belt, a blue cotton shirt, to a face that made her breath catch. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with eyes the color of a summer storm and a jawline that could have been carved from granite. A cowboy, judging by his attire and the lingering scent of horses and leather that surrounded him. "You all right, miss?" His voice was deep, a low rumble that seemed to vibrate through the air between them. "This ain't exactly the safest spot to be taking a rest." Harriet opened her mouth to respond, but as always, no sound emerged. Her face flushed hot with embarrassment as she tried again, managing only a small nod. The cowboy's expression shifted from concern to understanding. He crouched down, bringing himself to her eye level. "Can't speak or won't speak?" he asked gently. She held up 2 fingers, indicating the second option, and looked away, expecting to see the familiar flash of impatience or dismissal cross his face. Instead, when she dared to glance back, he was smiling. "That's all right," he said, extending a hand to help her up. "Some folks talk too much anyway. Name's Zachary Holden, most call me Zach." Harriet hesitated before placing her hand in his, allowing him to pull her to her feet. She brushed the dust from her skirts, still unable to meet his eyes. "What's your name?" he asked. When she didn't respond, he tilted his head. "Got something to write with?" She shook her head. "Then I reckon we'll have to figure something else out." His smile deepened, crinkling the corners of his eyes. "Tell you what, you point me toward where you're staying, and I'll see you safely there." "That sound agreeable?" Another shot rang out, this one farther away, and Harriet nodded quickly, pointing down the street toward her aunt's shop and attached living quarters. "Ah, you're staying at Martha's place. You must be the niece she's been expecting." He offered his arm. "Come on then, and don't you worry about explaining anything. I'll do the talking for us both." As they stepped out from behind the rain barrel, Harriet felt a strange flutter in her chest that had nothing to do with fear. Zachary Holden was the first person who hadn't immediately labeled her as odd or defective because of her silence. Instead, he'd simply adjusted, offering to be her voice without a second thought. She didn't know it then, but that moment hiding behind a rain barrel while gunshots echoed through Whispering Creek was the beginning of everything that would change her life. The walk to her aunt's shop was mercifully short. Zach kept himself between Harriet and the main street, where several men were still arguing loudly outside the saloon. He spoke casually as they walked, as if escorting silent women through gunfights was an everyday occurrence. "That ruckus is just Barton and his boys letting off steam. Nothing to worry about, they make more noise than trouble." He nodded to an older man sweeping the boardwalk in front of the general store. "Evening, Mr. Fletcher." "Holden," the man acknowledged with a tip of his hat. His gaze shifted to Harriet, curiosity evident. "This is Martha's niece," Zach explained smoothly. Just arrived from back east. We had a bit of a scare with Barton's antics, so I'm seeing her home. Pleased to meet you, miss, Mr. Fletcher said. Harriet managed a slight curtsy, her cheeks burning. She's had a long journey, Zach continued, saving her from the expectation of verbal response. Tired from the trail, I expect, Mr. Fletcher nodded sympathetically. Of course, you tell Martha I've got those buttons she ordered. Will do, Zach replied, guiding Harriet onward. When they reached the millinery shop, the closed sign was already hanging in the window, but a warm light glowed from within. Zach knocked firmly on the door. Martha, it's Zach Holden, got your niece here. The door swung open to reveal a thin woman with silver-streaked hair and kind eyes that widened at the sight of them. Harriet, oh my dear, I was beginning to worry. She pulled her niece into a swift embrace before turning to Zach. Thank you for bringing her, Mr. Holden. Where did you find her? Down by the mercantile. Barton and his crowd were making a ruckus, and she was waiting for things to settle. Aunt Martha clucked her tongue. Those troublemakers, are you all right, dear? She studied Harriet's face, then sighed when no answer came. Still not speaking then. Your mother wrote about your difficulty. Harriet stared at the floorboards, wishing she could sink through them. Nothing wrong with being quiet, Zach said, his voice firm but kind. Some folks just taken more than they put out. Aunt Martha smiled gratefully at him. That's a charitable way of looking at it, Mr. Holden. Would you care for some coffee? It's the least I can offer for your kindness. Much obliged, but I should get back to the ranch. Old man Garrett will be wondering where I've gotten to. He tipped his hat. Miss Harriet, it was a pleasure. Maybe I'll see you around town. Before Harriet could even nod, he was gone, his long strides carrying him quickly down the darkening street. She watched until he disappeared around a corner, an unfamiliar feeling of loss sweeping through her. Well, Aunt Martha said, closing the door. That's the first time Zachary Holden has escorted a lady anywhere in this town, to my knowledge, and I know most everything that happens in Whispering Creek. Her shrewd eyes assessed Harriet. He's a good man, works as foreman at the Garrett Ranch, keeps to himself mostly. Lost his parents in an Indian raid when he was just a boy. She patted Harriet's arm. Come now, you must be hungry. I've made stew. That night, lying in the narrow bed in her aunt's spare room, Harriet replayed the events of the evening. Zachary Holden's face appeared in her mind's eye, his quiet confidence and easy acceptance of her silence unlike anything she'd experienced before. Most people grew frustrated, thinking her stubborn or simple-minded. But he'd simply offered to speak for her, as if it were the most natural solution in the world. For the first time in years, Harriet fell asleep not feeling like something was wrong with her. Morning came with the sound of the shop bell as early customers arrived. Harriet dressed quickly in her plain brown skirt and white blouse, pinning her dark hair into a simple bun. When she entered the main room of the shop, her aunt was already helping a customer select ribbons. Ah, Harriet, come meet Mrs. Davis. She's our town librarian and one of my dearest friends. Mrs. Davis was a plump, cheerful woman with spectacles perched on her nose. So you're Martha's niece. Welcome to Whispering Creek, my dear. Harriet managed a smile and a small curtsy, her standard response when words failed her. Harriet doesn't speak much, Aunt Martha explained, the familiar explanation making Harriet's stomach twist with shame. But she's very clever with her hands. She'll be helping me in the shop. Oh, well, that's perfectly fine, Mrs. Davis said, though her expression held the same puzzled concern Harriet had seen countless times. The library is always open if you'd like to visit. Books don't require conversation. Harriet nodded gratefully. Books had always been her refuge. The morning passed in a blur of customers and hat trimmings. Aunt Martha was patient, showing Harriet the organization of the shop and demonstrating how to create simple decorations. By midday, Harriet had managed to assemble 3 hat bands with ribbon rosettes that even her aunt admitted were quite professional. When the lunch hour arrived, Aunt Martha sent Harriet to fetch bread from the bakery. It's just 3 doors down, dear. Mr. Whitman knows I order a loaf daily. Harriet hesitated at the door, anxiety climbing up her throat at the thought of facing a shopkeeper alone. Here, Aunt Martha pressed a coin and a small slate into her hands. Write what you need if you must, but try to manage. You're in the West now, Harriet. People here are different, more accepting of oddities. She smiled encouragingly. Besides, I suspect the whole town already knows about Martha's silent niece after last night. The street was busy with midday activity. Harriet kept her eyes down, clutching the slate as she hurried toward the bakery. The rich smell of fresh bread guided her as much as her aunt's directions. Just as she reached for the door, a familiar voice called out, "Miss Harriet, afternoon to you." She turned to find Zachary Holden dismounting from a handsome bay horse. He secured the reins to the hitching post and approached with a smile that made her heart skip. "Settling in all right?" he asked, removing his hat. The gesture revealed thick dark hair that curled slightly at the ends. Harriet nodded, attempting a smile, glad to hear it or see it, rather. His eyes were even more striking in daylight, a clear gray blue that reminded her of the ocean near her Boston home. "Where are you headed?" She pointed to the bakery. "Bread run for Martha. I'm heading that way myself." "Mind if I join you?" Before she could respond, he'd opened the door, gesturing for her to enter first. The baker, a flour-dusted man with enormous forearms, looked up from his work. "Afternoon, Mr. Holden." "Mr. Whitman," Zach greeted. "This is Miss Harriet Lawson, Martha's niece." "Ah, yes, Martha mentioned you'd be arriving." The baker smiled warmly. "What can I get for you today, Miss Lawson?" Harriet froze, her fingers tightening around the slate. Before she could fumble with it, Zach stepped in smoothly. "Martha's usual loaf, I expect." "And I'll take one as well, plus those ginger cookies if you've got any left." Mr. Whitman nodded, wrapping the bread in paper. "Just baked fresh this morning. That'll be 10 cents for Martha's and 15 for yours with the cookies." Harriet placed her coin on the counter, and Zach added his own money. As they exited the shop, Harriet found herself relaxing slightly in his presence. There was something comforting about his easy manner, the way he filled silences without making them uncomfortable. "Ranch business brings me to town today," he explained as they walked. "Garrett's looking to buy new stock and I'm checking prices. Have you seen much of Whispering Creek yet?" She shook her head. "It's not much compared to Boston, I imagine, but it's growing. Got a proper school now and Mrs. Davis's library, which is her pride and joy." He pointed down the street. "Doc Miller's place is there if you ever need him, though hoping you won't, and that's Sheriff Briggs's office across from the saloon, keeps him close to most of the trouble." Harriet listened intently, grateful for the orientation, and even more grateful for his continuation of their one-sided conversation without awkwardness. They reached the millinery shop too quickly. Harriet hesitated at the door, reluctant to end their encounter. "Miss Harriet," Zach said, his voice lowering slightly, "there's a social at the church this Saturday evening. Nothing fancy, just music and some food, folks getting together. Would you consider attending? I'd be happy to escort you and your aunt." Harriet's pulse quickened. A social meant people, conversations, expectations, all the things that terrified her. Yet something in Zach's expression made her want to be braver than she felt. Tentatively, she nodded. His smile could have outshone the sun. "Wonderful. I'll come by around 6 if that suits." He placed his hat back on his head. "Until then, Miss Harriet." She watched him stride away, wondering what she'd just agreed to and why the prospect filled her with equal parts dread and anticipation. Inside the shop, Aunt Martha took one look at her flushed face and raised an eyebrow. "I see you managed the bakery just fine, and perhaps encountered someone interesting along the way." For the first time since arriving in Whispering Creek, Harriet wished she could speak, if only to ask her aunt about the man who seemed determined to see past her silence. The days until Saturday passed more quickly than Harriet would have liked. Each morning brought new challenges as she learned to assist in the shop, but also small victories. By Friday, she could handle basic transactions using her slate and carefully rehearsed nods or shakes of her head. Some customers were clearly uncomfortable with her muteness, but others, particularly the older women of the town, seemed to adopt her as a curiosity worth protecting. "She's just shy, that's all," Harriet overheard Mrs. Peterson tell another woman. "Martha says she's smart as a whip, just keeps her thoughts to herself." "Still waters run deep," the other woman agreed. And did you hear Zach Holden's taking her to the social, that Cowboy's never shown interest in any girl since he came to town 5 years ago? Harriet pretended not to hear as she carefully arranged hat pins, but her cheeks burned. Was the whole town really discussing her and Zach? Saturday arrived with perfect autumn weather, crisp and sunny. Aunt Martha closed the shop early and insisted on helping Harriet prepare for the social. "It's not every day a young woman gets escorted by the most eligible bachelor in the county," she said, laying out Harriet's best dress, a modest blue cotton with lace at the collar and cuffs. "Let's put your hair up with these combs. They were your mother's, you know, before she sent them to me." The tortoiseshell combs were beautiful, carved with tiny flowers. As her aunt arranged her dark curls, Harriet stared at her reflection in the small mirror. The shy, pale face that looked back was familiar, but something in her eyes seemed different, a flicker of hope she hadn't seen in a long time. "There," Aunt Martha said, stepping back to admire her work. "You look lovely, dear. Your mother would be proud to see you." She patted Harriet's shoulder. "And don't worry about tonight. Just enjoy the music and the company. No one expects you to make speeches." When the knock came at the door precisely at 6, Harriet's hands were trembling so badly she could barely fasten her shawl. Aunt Martha answered the door, and Harriet heard Zach's deep voice greeting her warmly. Taking a deep breath, she stepped into the front room. Zach stood just inside the doorway, hat in hand, wearing clean dark trousers and a pressed white shirt. His usual worn leather vest had been replaced by a proper waistcoat, and his boots were polished to a shine. But it was his expression when he saw her that made Harriet's breath catch, a look of genuine appreciation that seemed to warm her from the inside out. "Miss Harriet," he said softly, "you look beautiful." She ducked her head, unable to meet his gaze but feeling a strange sort of pleasure at his compliment. "Now, Mr. Holden," Aunt Martha said, gathering her own shawl, "I expect you to make sure my niece enjoys herself tonight. No leaving her alone in corners while you discuss cattle prices with the menfolk." "Wouldn't dream of it, madam," he replied with a grin. "My dancing shoes are all polished up and ready." Dancing? Harriet hadn't considered that part of the evening's activities. Panic must have shown on her face because Zach quickly added, "Only if you'd like to, of course. The music's worth listening to even if you prefer just to watch." The church was only a short walk away, and already the sounds of a fiddle and piano could be heard as they approached. Lanterns hung from the trees surrounding the simple white building, casting a warm glow over the gathering. Inside, the pews had been pushed to the walls, creating an open space in the center where several couples were already dancing to a lively tune. Harriet hesitated at the entrance, overwhelmed by the noise and activity. Zach's hand found her elbow, a steady presence. "Take all the time you need," he murmured near her ear. "We can stay right here until you're ready to go in." His understanding nearly undid her. How did this man she barely knew seem to read her so well? Eventually, they made their way inside. Aunt Martha was quickly swept away by her friends, leaving Harriet and Zach standing near the refreshment table. Several people nodded greetings, curious glances flickering between them. "Punch." Zach offered, Harriet nodded, grateful for the distraction. As he turned to fetch the drinks, a young woman approximately Harriet's age approached, her pretty face alight with curiosity. "You must be Harriet Lawson. I'm Rebecca Miller, the doctor's daughter." She smiled warmly. "We're so glad you've come to Whispering Creek. New faces are always welcome, especially young ladies. The men outnumber us terribly, you know." Harriet managed a small smile and nod, her hands twisting nervously in her skirts. Rebecca waited expectantly for a verbal response, her smile faltering slightly when none came. "I hear you're from Boston. That must be quite different from our little town." Again, Harriet could only nod, discomfort rising within her. She glanced around for Zach or her aunt, finding neither close by. "They said you were shy," Rebecca continued, lowering her voice, "but I didn't realize you didn't speak at all. Is it because you're deaf?" "My father treated a deaf man once who—" "Miss Miller," Zach's voice interrupted as he returned with 2 cups of punch. "Lovely to see you. Have you met Miss Lawson properly?" "I was just introducing myself," Rebecca said, a hint of defensiveness in her tone. Though conversation seems rather one-sided. The best conversations often are, Zach replied smoothly, handing Harriet her punch. Sometimes listening reveals more than speaking ever could, don't you think? Rebecca blinked, clearly unsure how to respond to that. I suppose. Well, I should find my father. Enjoy the social, Miss Lawson. She hurried away, glancing back over her shoulder with undisguised curiosity. Thank you, Harriet mouthed, the words silent but her gratitude evident. No need for thanks, Zach said, guiding her to a quieter spot near the wall. Rebecca means well, but she's never been known for her tact. The music shifted to a slower tune, and several older couples took to the floor. Harriet watched them, sipping her punch and trying to ignore the occasional glances from other attendees. Would you like to dance? Zach asked after a while. This waltz is simple enough, and I promise not to step on your toes. Well, I'll try my best not to anyway. Harriet hesitated, her heart racing at the thought. Dancing meant being close to him, being the center of attention. But the warmth in his eyes gave her courage she didn't know she possessed. Carefully setting down her punch cup, she nodded. Zach led her to the edge of the dance floor, positioning one hand lightly at her waist and taking her hand with the other. Just follow my lead, he said softly. I'll do the talking for us both, remember? And somehow she did follow, her feet finding the rhythm as he guided her gently through the steps. They started at the edge of the floor, away from most eyes, but as her confidence grew, Zach moved them further into the center. Harriet kept her gaze fixed on his shoulder, too nervous to look up, but she could feel the strength in his arms, the careful way he held her close enough to guide but not so close as to cause gossip. You're a natural, he murmured as they turned. Must be all that proper Boston upbringing. A small smile tugged at her lips. There it is, he said, his voice warm with approval. I've been wondering what your smile looked like. It's even prettier than I imagined. Harriet dared to glance up then, meeting his gaze for perhaps the first time. The open admiration she found there made her breath catch. No one had ever looked at her that way before, as if her silence made her more interesting rather than less. They danced 3 more songs before taking a break for refreshments. Aunt Martha found them by the punch bowl, her eyes twinkling with approval. You two make a handsome pair on the dance floor, she said. Harriet, I had no idea you were such an accomplished dancer. She's full of surprises, Zach said, his smile directed at Harriet rather than her aunt. Would you ladies excuse me for a moment? I promised Sheriff Briggs I'd have a word about one of the Garrett horses he's interested in. As he walked away, Aunt Martha leaned closer to Harriet. Half the young ladies in this room are green with envy, my dear. Zachary Holden hasn't danced with anyone since he came to town. Harriet felt a flutter of pleasure at this information, though she couldn't quite believe it. Surely a man like Zach, handsome, kind, established in his position, could have his pick of women who could carry on proper conversations and didn't hide behind slates and nods. The remainder of the evening passed in a pleasant blur. Zach returned and introduced Harriet to several of his friends, seamlessly facilitating interactions without drawing attention to her silence. By the time they walked Aunt Martha home under a sky brilliant with stars, Harriet felt lighter than she had in years. At the door to the millinery shop, Aunt Martha tactfully mentioned needing to check something inside, leaving Harriet and Zach alone on the porch. I hope you enjoyed yourself tonight, he said, his voice low in the quiet evening. I certainly did. Harriet nodded emphatically, hoping he could see her sincerity in the dim light. Good. He hesitated, seeming uncharacteristically uncertain. Miss Harriet, I'd like to call on you properly if you're amenable. Perhaps take you for a ride out to see the countryside when you're not needed in the shop. Her heart soared at the suggestion, but anxiety quickly followed. Outings meant more people, more situations where her silence would be noticed, questioned. Zach seemed to read her thoughts. Just the 2 of us, he clarified. There's a spot by the creek that's peaceful as can be, good place for thinking or not thinking if you prefer. Slowly, Harriet nodded. Tomorrow's Sunday, he continued. Would afternoon suit, say around 2 o'clock? I'll bring a horse gentle enough for even a city girl. Another nod, this one accompanied by a small smile. Then it's settled. He took her hand, his touch warm and surprisingly gentle for a man who worked with horses and cattle. "Good night, Miss Harriet, sweet dreams." The brush of his lips against her knuckles was so brief she might have imagined it, but the tingle it left behind lingered long after he disappeared into the night. Sunday dawned clear and mild, perfect weather for riding. Harriet attended church with her aunt in the morning, enduring the curious glances and whispers with more equanimity than she would have thought possible a week ago. The knowledge that Zach would be calling for her later seemed to fortify her against the discomfort of being the town's newest curiosity. After a light midday meal, she changed into her plainest skirt and sturdiest boots, neither really suitable for riding, but the best she could manage. Aunt Martha helped her pin her hair more securely and insisted she wear a bonnet. "The sun out here is fiercer than back east," she warned. "You'll freckle in minutes without protection." At precisely 2 o'clock, they heard the sound of horses outside. Harriet's stomach fluttered with nervous anticipation as she peered out the window. Zach was dismounting from his bay, leading a smaller, dappled mare by the reins. "You be careful," Aunt Martha said, adjusting Harriet's bonnet strings. Zach Holden's reputation is impeccable, but still appearances matter in a small town. Harriet nodded her understanding. Though her aunt hadn't said it directly, the implication was clear. Being alone with a man, even one as respected as Zach, could start tongues wagging. When she stepped outside, Zach's smile made her momentary concerns fade. He was dressed in his everyday clothes-worn denim, cotton shirt, leather vest, and looked far more at ease than he had at the social. "Afternoon, Miss Harriet. This is Daisy," he said, patting the dappled mare's neck. "Gentlest horse on the Garrett Ranch. She'll take good care of you." Harriet approached cautiously. She'd ridden before, but only in Boston's parks on placid, well-trained mounts with guides leading them. Daisy eyed her calmly, then lowered her head to sniff at Harriet's hand. "She likes you," Zach observed. "Horses are good judges of character, ready to mount up." After a moment's hesitation, Harriet nodded. Zach cupped his hands to give her a boost, and suddenly she was settled in the saddle, higher off the ground than she'd expected. The mare shifted beneath her, adjusting to her weight, and Harriet gripped the saddle horn tightly. "You're doing fine," Zach assured her, adjusting the stirrups to fit her shorter legs. "Just relax and let Daisy do the work. She'll follow my horse without you having to guide her much." He mounted his own horse with practiced ease, and they set off at a walk, Zach leading them away from town toward the open countryside. The sun was warm on Harriet's face, the gentle sway of the horse beneath her strangely soothing once she grew accustomed to it. "Town's been here about 15 years, Zach explained as they rode. "Started as just a trading post, then grew when they found silver in the hills to the north. The boom didn't last, veins weren't as rich as they hoped, but enough folks stayed to build something lasting." Harriet listened, absorbing the history of her new home and watching the landscape unfold around them. The terrain was so different from Massachusetts, more open, with rolling hills covered in grasses and scattered trees. In the distance, blue-gray mountains rose against the sky. Despite the vastness, there was an intimacy to riding side by side, just the two of them in this enormous space. They followed a dirt trail that gradually descended toward a creek lined with cottonwood trees. The water sparkled in the afternoon sun, a ribbon of silver cutting through the golden landscape. "This is the spot I mentioned," Zach said, reining in his horse near a grassy bank. "Whispering Creek itself, town's named after it, though most folks have forgotten why. Listen carefully, and you can hear why the first settlers called it that." As they dismounted, Zach lifting Harriet down with hands strong enough to make her feel weightless, she heard it. A soft, almost musical sound as the water flowed over rocks and roots, creating a gentle murmuring that did indeed sound like whispering. "Pretty, isn't it?" Zach secured the horses to a low branch where they could graze, then spread a small blanket on the grassy bank. "Thought we might sit a spell. I brought some of those ginger cookies from Whitman's bakery." They settled on the blanket, the creek burbling beside them. Harriet accepted a cookie, nibbling at it while taking in their surroundings. It was peaceful here, with only the sounds of nature and the occasional soft nickering of the horses. "I come here when the ranch gets too noisy or when Garrett's in one of his moods," Zach said, stretching his long legs out before him. Good place to think. He fell silent then, seemingly content to simply share the moment without filling it with words. Harriet found herself relaxing, the constant tension she carried in her shoulders and throat easing slightly. Here, with just Zach and the whispers of the creek, her silence didn't feel like a barrier or a failing. It felt natural. After a while, Zach spoke again, his voice thoughtful. "My mother used to say that God gives each person different gifts. Some folks can sing, some can build things, some can grow the best corn you ever tasted." He glanced at her. "Some can listen in a way that makes others feel truly heard." Harriet blinked, surprised by this perspective. "I've known plenty of folks who talk constantly but never say anything worth hearing," he continued. "And I've seen how people open up to you in the shop." Mrs. Peterson told Martha she'd never shared the story of her son's passing with anyone before she found herself telling you yesterday. It was true. The older woman had come in for ribbon and ended up pouring out her heart while Harriet listened, nodding at appropriate moments and eventually reaching out to squeeze the grieving mother's hand. "That's a gift, Miss Harriet. Don't let anyone tell you different." Tears pricked at Harriet's eyes. All her life, her silence had been treated as an affliction, a problem to be fixed, never as a gift. Impulsively, she reached for her reticule and withdrew the small slate and chalk she now carried everywhere. Her fingers trembled slightly as she wrote, "Thank you." Zach read the words, then met her eyes with a smile that reached all the way to his own. "You're welcome." For the next hour, they sat by the creek, Harriet occasionally writing brief responses on her slate, while Zach told stories of his years on the ranch, the blizzard of '72 that had nearly wiped out the herd, the time he'd had to deliver a foal in the middle of a thunderstorm, the cantankerous old cook who made the best biscuits in 3 territories, but threatened to quit at least once a week. As the afternoon waned, Harriet found herself wishing the day wouldn't end. There was something magical about this place, this moment, this man who seemed to accept her exactly as she was. Eventually, though, Zach glanced at the sky and sighed. "We should head back before your aunt starts to worry." The ride back to town was quieter, both of them seemingly lost in their own thoughts. As they approached Whispering Creek, the sound of church bells rang out for evening services. "Miss Harriet," Zach said as they neared the millinery shop, "would it be all right if I called on you again?" "Perhaps next Sunday," Harriet nodded without hesitation, a smile breaking across her face before she could think to temper it. "Good," he said, his own smile matching hers. "That's real good." When he helped her dismount in front of the shop, his hands lingered at her waist a moment longer than necessary. "Thank you for your company today," he said softly. "I haven't enjoyed an afternoon so much in a very long time." Before she could respond, even with her slate, the shop door opened and Aunt Martha appeared. "There you are. I was beginning to wonder. Come inside, Harriet. There's a storm brewing to the west. You can see the clouds coming in." Sure enough, dark clouds were gathering on the horizon, though the sky above them remained clear. "Better get back to the ranch," Zach said, mounting his horse and taking Daisy's reins. "Good evening, ladies. Miss Harriet, I'll see you next Sunday." As he rode away, Aunt Martha gave Harriet a knowing look. "Next Sunday, is it? My. That night, as rain pattered against the roof and thunder rumbled in the distance, Harriet lay awake thinking of creek whispers and a man who saw her silence as a gift. The following weeks fell into a pattern. Weekdays were spent helping in the shop, where Harriet gradually gained confidence in her interactions with customers. Sundays belonged to Zach, who faithfully appeared at 2 o'clock with Daisy saddled and ready. Their rides took them to different parts of the surrounding countryside, a hidden waterfall, an abandoned miner's cabin, a hilltop with views that stretched for miles. Sometimes they would sit and share the treats Zach invariably brought along. Other times they would simply ride, enjoying the landscape and each other's company. Harriet began carrying a small notebook instead of her slate, filling pages with her thoughts and questions. Zach would read her words carefully, responding as if they were having a normal conversation. Through these written exchanges, She shared pieces of her life in Boston, her love of books, her difficulties in school, her father's death from influenza when she was 12, her mother's subsequent remarriage to a man who found Harriet's silence irritating. In turn, Zach told her more about himself, how he'd been orphaned at 11 when Comanche raiders attacked the small homestead where his family had settled, how a cavalry officer had found him hiding in the root cellar and brought him to the nearest town, how he'd worked odd jobs until old man Garrett had taken him on as a stable boy. Years of hard work and honest dealing had earned him the position of foreman, and now, at 28, he was saving to buy his own small spread. "Nothing fancy," he explained as they sat beneath a giant oak tree on their fourth Sunday outing. "Just enough land for a decent herd and a home of my own." Harriet wrote in her notebook, "You would be a good rancher." "Hope so," he replied, watching as a hawk circled overhead. "Been learning from Garrett for years. Man knows cattle better than anyone, even if he is the most ornery cuss west of the Mississippi." "Why do you stay with him?" "Loyalty, I suppose, and practicality. The wages are fair, and he's promised me first option to buy the north section when he's ready to sell." "That's good land, has its own water access and enough pasture for 50 head. Harriet nodded, understanding. In the month she'd been in Whispering Creek, she'd learned that water rights were as valuable as gold in this part of the country. "What about you?" Zach asked, his voice casual though his eyes were intent. "You planning to stay in Whispering Creek, or will Boston call you home eventually?" The question made Harriet's heart beat faster. Was he asking about her plans because he cared where she would be? She wrote carefully, "I like it here more than I expected." It was true. Despite her initial fears, the small town had begun to feel like home. People had largely accepted her silence as just another quirk, like Mr. Fletcher's wooden leg or Mrs. Davis's tendency to recite poetry at inappropriate moments, and there was Zach, whose Sunday visits had become the center around which her week revolved. "Glad to hear it," he said, and something in his tone made her look up from her notebook. He was watching her with an expression that made her breath catch a mixture of tenderness and something deeper that she was afraid to name. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other, the air between them charged with unspoken feelings. Then Zach cleared his throat and glanced away. "We should head back. Looks like weather coming in again." The ride back to town was quiet, but not uncomfortably so. When they reached the millinery shop, Zach helped her dismount as usual, but this time his hands lingered at her waist. "Miss Harriet," he said, his voice lower than normal, "I've been meaning to ask, that is, I was wondering if." He stopped, seeming uncharacteristically flustered. "Would it be all right if I kissed you, just once? I've been thinking about it more than I probably should admit." Harriet's heart nearly stopped. She'd been dreaming of this very moment, but hadn't dared hope it might actually happen. Slowly, she nodded, her eyes never leaving his. Zach's hands moved from her waist to gently cup her face. He leaned down, giving her plenty of time to change her mind, then pressed his lips to hers in a kiss so soft and sweet it made her eyes sting with unexpected tears. It was brief proper by any standard, but when he pulled away, Harriet felt fundamentally changed, as if some long dormant part of her had suddenly awakened. "Thank you," Zach whispered, his thumbs brushing her cheeks. "I've been wanting to do that since I found you hiding behind that rain barrel." Harriet smiled, warmth spreading through her entire body. On impulse, she reached up and touched his face, tracing the strong line of his jaw with gentle fingers. The sound of the shop door opening broke the moment. Aunt Martha appeared, her expression a mixture of approval and concern. "Evening, Mr. Holden," she said, a hint of warning in her tone. "Getting rather late, isn't it?" "Yes, madam," Zach replied, stepping back from Harriet with reluctance. "Just seeing Miss Harriet safely home, Aunt Martha murmured, not entirely convinced. "Will we see you at church tomorrow morning?" "Yes, madam, wouldn't miss it." After he rode away, Aunt Martha turned to Harriet with raised eyebrows. Well, things seemed to be progressing rather quickly. Harriet couldn't hide her smile or the blush that warmed her cheeks. Her aunt's expression softened. "He's a good man, Harriet, one of the best in these parts, but remember, reputations are fragile things, especially for young women." Nodding her understanding, Harriet followed her aunt inside, her mind still lingering on the feel of Zach's lips against hers and the look in his eyes afterward. For the first time in her life, she didn't feel broken or lacking. In Zach's eyes, she was whole, just as she was. The next morning at church, Harriet was acutely aware of Zach's presence several pews behind her. Throughout the service, she could feel his gaze on her, warm and steady. When the congregation rose to sing hymns, she turned slightly and caught his eye. The smile he gave her made her heart flutter like a captured bird. After the service, as people mingled outside in the autumn sunshine, Zach made his way to where Harriet stood with her aunt. "Mrs. Lawson, Miss Harriet," he greeted them, hat in hand. "Beautiful morning, isn't it?" "Indeed it is, Mr. Holden," Aunt Martha replied. "Will you be joining us for the church picnic next week? The whole town turns out for its last big gathering before winter sets in." "Wouldn't miss it," he said, his eyes finding Harriet's. "In fact, I was hoping Miss Harriet might allow me to escort her." Before Aunt Martha could answer for her, a commotion near the church steps drew their attention. A man Harriet didn't recognize was dismounting from a lathered horse, his expression urgent as he scanned the crowd. "Zach," he called, spotting them. "Need you at the ranch right away. North fence lines down and half the herd scattered toward Thompson's property." Zach's expression shifted instantly from relaxed to focused. "On my way, Pete." He turned back to Harriet and her aunt. "My apologies, ladies. Duty calls." "Of course," Aunt Martha said. "Go on now. Those cattle won't gather themselves." With a quick bow and a lingering glance at Harriet, Zach hurried away, already issuing instructions to the ranch hand as they mounted their horses. "Ranching is an unpredictable life," Aunt Martha commented as they watched the men ride off. "Never know when emergencies will arise. Something to consider, my dear, if your affections are becoming engaged." Harriet nodded absently, her eyes following Zach until he disappeared from view. Her affections weren't becoming engaged, they already were, thoroughly and completely. The realization both thrilled and terrified her. What future could there be for a woman who couldn't speak and a man whose life was built around a demanding, unpredictable profession? The answer to that question would have to wait. 3 days passed with no word from Zach, though Harriet found herself watching the door of the shop whenever the bell jingled, hoping to see his tall figure. On the 4th day, just as they were preparing to close the shop, the door opened to reveal not Zach but the ranch hand who had fetched him from church, Pete, if she remembered correctly. "Afternoon, ladies," he said, removing his hat. "I've got a message for Miss Lawson from Zach." Harriet's heart leapt, then plummeted as she noticed the man's serious expression. "Is Mr. Holden all right?" Aunt Martha asked, voicing Harriet's fear. "Yes, madam, though he's had better days," Pete replied. "Got himself thrown from his horse while we were rounding up strays in the North Canyon. Broke his leg pretty bad. Doc Miller had to set it. He's laid up at the ranch and like to be for some weeks, according to the doc." Harriet felt the color drain from her face. She gripped the counter for support, her mind filled with terrible images of Zach injured and in pain. "He asked me to tell Miss Lawson he's mighty sorry about missing their Sunday ride," Pete continued, his eyes kind as they met Harriet's. "Said to tell you he'll make it up to you as soon as he's back on his feet." Aunt Martha thanked the ranch hand for delivering the message, then turned to Harriet once he'd left. "Well, that's unfortunate timing. Poor Mr. Holden." Harriet grabbed her slate from beneath the counter and wrote quickly, "We should visit him." Her aunt's eyebrows rose. "Visit a bachelor at his place of employment. That would be most irregular, Harriet. He's injured. It would be a kindness. Even so, propriety must be observed." Aunt Martha considered for a moment. "Perhaps we could bring him some food. A home-cooked meal might be welcome, and we could deliver it together, making it a brief, proper visit." Harriet nodded eagerly, already planning what they could prepare. If Zach couldn't come to town, she would find a way to see him even if only for a few minutes. The next day, they closed the shop early. Harriet had spent the morning baking bread and helping her aunt prepare a hearty stew and apple pie. They packed everything carefully in a basket, along with a jar of preserves and some of the ginger cookies Zach favored. The Garrett Ranch was 5 miles outside of town, a substantial property marked by a weather-beaten sign at the entrance to a long drive. The main house was a sprawling single-story structure with several outbuildings and corrals nearby. As their rented buggy approached, a weathered man with a thick gray beard emerged onto the porch. "That's Old Man Garrett himself," Aunt Martha murmured. "Not the most sociable fellow, but fair in his business dealings." Mr. Garrett watched them pull up with undisguised curiosity. "Afternoon, ladies," he called as they stopped the buggy. "What brings you out this way?" "Good afternoon, Mr. Garrett," Aunt Martha replied, her tone pleasantly formal. "We heard about Mr. Holden's accident and thought to bring him some home-cooked food." "I'm Martha Lawson from the millinery shop in town, and this is my niece, Harriet." The old rancher's bushy eyebrows rose slightly. "So you're the girl Zach's been mooning over these past weeks, wondered who'd finally caught his eye." He nodded toward the house. "He's inside, laid up in the room off the kitchen. Doc says he's not to put weight on that leg for at least a month, which means I'm short a foreman during the busiest season." Despite his gruff words, there was a note of concern in his voice. "May we see him?" Aunt Martha asked, coarse. "Just don't tire him out. Boy's already fretting about all the work not getting done." He helped them down from the buggy and led them into the house, which was sparsely furnished but clean. Zach was lying on a narrow bed in a small room that seemed to be a converted pantry. His left leg was splinted and elevated on pillows, and his face was pale beneath his tan, with shadows under his eyes suggesting pain or poor sleep, perhaps both. When he saw Harriet, however, his entire countenance brightened. "Miss Harriet, Mrs. Lawson, this is an unexpected pleasure." Harriet's heart twisted at the sight of him confined to bed, but she managed a smile as she followed her aunt into the room. "We brought you some proper food," Aunt Martha said, placing the basket on a small table. "I imagine ranch cooking leaves something to be desired." "You have no idea," Zach replied with feeling. "Cookie's good with beans and beef, but that's about the extent of his repertoire. This is incredibly kind of you both." Mr. Garrett harumphed from the doorway. "I'll leave you folks to visit, got work to see to." He looked pointedly at Zach. "Don't let them stay too long. You need rest." After he left, Aunt Martha busied herself unpacking the food while Harriet stood awkwardly by the bed, distressed by Zach's condition but uncertain how to express it. "It looks worse than it is," Zach said, correctly interpreting her concern. "Clean break, Doc says, should heal just fine with time and rest," he grimaced. "It's the sitting still that's the hard part." Harriet reached for her notebook and wrote quickly, "How did it happen?" "Fool mistake," he admitted. "Was chasing a stray calf along the ridge and didn't see the badger hole. Horse went down and I went flying, landed badly." He shook his head ruefully. "Worst part is we lost the calf anyway. I was worried when you didn't come to town. I wanted to send word sooner, but things were chaotic. I'm sorry if I caused you concern." Their eyes met, and the connection between them seemed to deepen, as if the shared adversity had somehow strengthened the bond forming between them. Aunt Martha cleared her throat, breaking the moment. "Well, everything's unpacked. The stew should be warmed before eating, but the bread and pie are ready to enjoy. Is there anything else you need, Mr. Holden?" "This is more than generous already," he assured her. Though, he hesitated, glancing at Harriet, "I don't suppose you ladies might be able to visit again." "The days get mighty long with nothing but Garrett's complaining and Cookie's tall tales for company." "We'll see what can be arranged," Aunt Martha replied, her tone noncommittal but her eyes kind. "Come, Harriet, we should let Mr. Holden rest." Harriet lingered a moment longer, writing one more note, "I'll come back soon." Zach's smile was like sunrise breaking through clouds. "I'll hold you to that, Miss Harriet." True to her word, Harriet did return not just once but regularly over the following weeks. Sometimes Aunt Martha accompanied her, but as autumn deepened toward winter, the older woman found the journey increasingly taxing on her arthritic joints. After ensuring that Mrs. Garrett's housekeeper would always be present as chaperone, she allowed Harriet to make the visits alone. These afternoons became precious to both Harriet and Zach. As his legs slowly healed, they developed new routines to replace their Sunday rides. Harriet would bring books to read aloud. Her voice, when used for reading rather than conversation, emerged clear and pleasant. Zach would tell her about ranch happenings and progress on his recovery, and they would play checkers or cards to pass the hours. Through these quiet afternoons, their connection deepened. Harriet found herself sharing things in writing that she'd never told anyone, her dreams of someday running her own small business, her fear that her silence would always make her an outsider, her childhood memories of happier times before her father's death. Zach, in turn, spoke of his hopes for the future, his occasional loneliness despite being surrounded by ranch hands, his determination to make something of himself despite his orphaned beginnings. "I've been saving every penny," he told her one snowy afternoon in early December. "Almost have enough for a down payment on that north section I mentioned. Garrett's agreed to sell it to me in the spring." Harriet wrote, "That's wonderful news. You must be excited." "I am." He shifted on the bed, his splinted leg now able to bear some weight but still not fully healed. "Got plans for it already, where to build the house, how to arrange the corrals. It won't be much at first, but it'll be mine." There was a pause, laden with unspoken thoughts. Then Zach reached for her hand, his expression turning serious. "Miss Harriet, no, Harriet," he corrected himself, his voice softening on her name. "These past weeks, having you here, they've meant everything to me, more than I can properly express." Harriet's heart began to race. She squeezed his hand, encouraging him to continue. "I know it hasn't been very long, and I'm not in a position to offer much right now, but I need you to know that my feelings for you are serious. The most serious I've ever felt about anything or anyone." She drew in a shaky breath, hardly daring to believe what she was hearing. "I'm not asking for promises today," he continued. "Just, when you think about your future, whether here or back east, I hope you might consider the possibility of a place in it for me." Tears welled in Harriet's eyes. She reached for her notebook with trembling fingers and wrote a single word. "Yes." Zach's face transformed with joy. He tugged gently on her hand, drawing her closer until she perched on the edge of the bed. With infinite tenderness, he traced the curve of her cheek. "May I kiss you, Harriet Lawson?" he whispered. Her answer was to lean forward and press her lips to his. This kiss was different from their first, deeper, more certain, filled with promises neither of them had the words to express aloud. When they finally parted, Zach rested his forehead against hers, his breathing uneven. "I think I'm falling in love with you," he murmured. "No, I know I am." Harriet pulled back just enough to write in her notebook, "I love you too." The happiness that blazed across his face was like nothing she'd ever seen, as if all the sunshine of summer had been distilled into a single expression. He kissed her again, his hand cradling the back of her head with exquisite care. A discreet cough from the doorway startled them apart. "Mrs. Garrett stood there, her expression a mixture of amusement and disapproval. "Miss Lawson, the weather's turning. If you're to make it back to town before dark, you should leave now." Blushing furiously, Harriet gathered her things, avoiding the housekeeper's knowing gaze. Before she left, she wrote one more note to Zach, "Until tomorrow." His smile followed her all the way home through the gathering snow. The week before Christmas brought significant changes. Doc Miller finally declared Zach fit enough to return to light duties, meaning he could make the trip into town. His first visit to the millinery shop caused such a stir that Harriet was certain the entire town knew of their understanding within hours. "Never seen Zach Holden look at anyone the way he looks at that quiet girl of Martha's," Mrs. Peterson told her friend loudly enough for Harriet to overhear. "Mark my words, there'll be a wedding by spring." The idea both thrilled and terrified Harriet. Marriage to Zach was everything she could wish for, but the thought of a wedding standing before the entire town, expected to speak vows she couldn't voice, filled her with dread. She confessed this fear to Zach during one of their walks, bundled against the winter cold as they strolled down Whispering Creek's main street. "Everyone would be staring at me, waiting for me to speak," she wrote, her handwriting betraying her anxiety. "What if I can't do it?" "Then I'll do the talking for us both," Zach replied simply. "Just like I promised that first day, the words don't matter, Harriet, only the feeling behind them." His unwavering acceptance never failed to humble her. How had she found this man who seemed to understand her so completely? Christmas Eve brought a heavy snowfall that transformed Whispering Creek into a wonderland of white. The church was packed for the evening service, the pews filled with families dressed in their finest. Harriet sat between her aunt and Zach, acutely aware of the sidelong glances and whispers their obvious closeness generated after the service, as people mingled in the churchyard despite the cold. Zach drew her slightly apart from the crowd. "I have something for you," he said, reaching into his coat pocket. "Wanted to give it to you tonight with the stars and the snow making everything look like magic." From his pocket, he withdrew a small velvet pouch. Tipping the contents into his palm, he revealed a delicate gold ring set with a small pearl. "It was my mother's," he explained, his voice husky with emotion. "The only thing of hers I managed to save. I've carried it with me all these years, waiting for the right person to give it to." Harriet's heart seemed to stop, then race forward at twice its normal speed. "Harriet Lawson," Zach continued, taking her gloved hand in his, "I love you more than I ever thought possible. You've shown me that there are ways to communicate far deeper than words. Your silence has taught me to listen with my heart, and what I hear there is beautiful beyond measure." Tears filled her eyes, blurring the churchyard lights into stars. "Will you marry me?" he asked, his eyes holding hers with an intensity that took her breath away. "Will you build a life with me on that piece of land, make a home with me, grow old with me?" For a moment, Harriet wished more than anything that she could speak, that she could tell him all that was in her heart. But as she looked into his eyes, she realized he already knew. He had always known. Slowly, deliberately, she nodded. Then, drawing a deep breath and summoning every ounce of courage she possessed, she whispered, "Yes." It was barely audible, hardly more than a breath shaped into sound, but it was a word, her word, given to him. Zach's eyes widened in astonishment, then filled with such joy it nearly broke her heart. "Did you just—" She nodded again, tears spilling down her cheeks now. With reverent care, he slipped the ring onto her finger, then pulled her into his arms, holding her as if she were made of the most precious material on earth. "I love you," he murmured against her hair. "So much." Around them, the snow continued to fall, dusting their shoulders and hair with crystals that caught the light from the church windows. Neither noticed the cold or the curious glances from the dispersing congregation. In that moment, they existed in a world of their own, making a world where silence spoke volumes and a single whispered word contained all the promises of a lifetime. Spring arrived in a burst of wildflowers and green grass, transforming the landscape around Whispering Creek. The wedding was set for the first Saturday in May, when the weather would be mild and travel easy for the few distant relatives invited to attend. In the months following their engagement, Harriet had spoken only a handful of words, and only to Zach. Her voice, when it came, was soft and slightly husky from disuse, but to Zach, it was the most beautiful sound in the world. She still relied primarily on her notebook for communication, but the knowledge that she could speak if she chose to, that her silence was truly a choice rather than an affliction, gave her a new confidence. The north section of the Garrett Ranch officially became Zach's property in late March. Together, they selected the site for their home, a gentle rise overlooking the creek, sheltered by cottonwood trees. Construction began immediately, with Zach and several ranch hands working long hours to have at least the basic structure completed before the wedding. Aunt Martha, though genuinely happy for her niece, couldn't help expressing concern about the practicalities of their situation. "You'll be so isolated out there," she fretted as she helped Harriet with wedding preparations. 5 miles from town, with no neighbors within shouting distance. "What if there's an emergency and you can't call for help?" "Zach will be with me," Harriet wrote, her expression serene. "And I'm stronger than you think." Indeed, she had discovered reservoirs of strength within herself that she'd never known existed. The shy, silent girl who had arrived in Whispering Creek less than a year ago had blossomed into a woman who, while still quiet, carried herself with dignity and purpose. The day before the wedding, Rebecca Miller now married herself to the young banker's son stopped by the millinery shop. She had never become a close friend, but relations between them had warmed considerably since their awkward first meeting at the church social. "I brought you something," she said, presenting Harriet with a small package. "A wedding gift, though perhaps you should open it now." Inside was a beautiful leather-bound journal and an expensive fountain pen. "For when you need to speak but prefer to write," Rebecca explained. "Frank says I talk enough for 3 people, so I can't fully understand your situation, but I respect it and I wish you every happiness with Zach. He's a good man." Touched by the thoughtful gift, Harriet impulsively hugged her, earning a startled but pleased smile in return. That evening, as she packed the last of her belongings, Aunt Martha brought out a final surprise, a handsome carved wooden box. "It was your mother's hope chest," she explained. "She sent it to me when you decided to stay, along with some things she thought you might want for your new home." Together, they unpacked the box, finding linens embroidered by Harriet's grandmother, a silver tea service that had been a wedding gift to her parents, and several books from her father's collection. At the bottom was a letter from her mother, which Harriet read with tears in her eyes. "She wants to visit in the fall," Aunt Martha said. "She's proud of you, Harriet, we both are." The wedding day dawned clear and perfect, as if nature itself approved of the union. The small church was decorated with wildflowers and ribbons, filled with the residents of Whispering Creek and a few guests from neighboring towns. Zach stood at the altar, looking both nervous and elated in his new suit, his hair neatly trimmed for the occasion. When Harriet appeared at the back of the church on her aunt's arm, a collective murmur of appreciation rippled through the congregation. Her dress, made by her own hands with help from Aunt Martha, was simple but elegant ivory satin with lace at the collar and cuffs, reminiscent of the dress she'd worn to the social where she and Zach had first danced. As she walked toward him, Harriet felt none of the panic she had feared. There was only a profound sense of rightness, of coming home. Zach's eyes never left hers, his expression so full of love it made her heart ache with happiness. When they reached the altar and Reverend Thompson began the ceremony, Harriet felt a moment of anxiety as the time for vows approached. She and Zach had discussed this at length, and the Reverend had been accommodating, agreeing to a slight modification of the traditional service. "Zachary Holden," the Reverend said, "do you take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, until death do you part?" "I do," Zach answered, his voice clear and strong. Then, before the Reverend could continue, he turned to face Harriet fully, taking both her hands in his. "Harriet Lawson," he said, "in front of all these witnesses, I pledge my life and love to you. I promise to be your voice when you need one, your strength when you falter, your comfort in sorrow, and your companion in joy. I will listen to the words you write and the silences between them. I will cherish your quiet nature and protect the sacred space it creates. From this day forward, you will never walk alone, never face the world without me beside you, never lack for someone who understands the language of your heart." Tears filled Harriet's eyes at these unexpected words. Zach squeezed her hands gently, encouraging her. "Harriet," Reverend Thompson said kindly, "do you take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband? If so, please indicate your assent in whatever way feels right to you." Drawing a deep breath, Harriet looked directly into Zach's eyes and whispered, "I do." Though few in the congregation could hear her, Zach's radiant smile told everyone all they needed to know. The Reverend pronounced them husband and wife, and Zach sealed their union with a kiss that promised a lifetime of understanding and acceptance. The celebration afterward was joyous, with music and dancing continuing well into the evening. Harriet danced only with her new husband, content to let him guide her through the steps just as he had at that first social. When they finally departed for their new home, still partially under construction, but with the bedroom and kitchen completed, the entire town turned out to see them off, showering them with flower petals and good wishes. Their first night as husband and wife was spent in the house that would be their home for the rest of their lives. Though it was simple, with many finishing touches yet to be added, to Harriet it was perfect, a physical manifestation of the future they would build together. As they lay together in the darkness, listening to the night sounds through the open window, Zach pulled her close against his chest. "Happy, Mrs. Holden," he murmured against her hair. In answer, she turned in his arms and whispered, "Very happy." His smile in the moonlight was worth every effort those 2 words had cost her. "I love you," he said, kissing her forehead. "Talking or not talking, writing or silent, I love all of you exactly as you are." "I love you too," she whispered back, the words coming slightly easier this time. And in that moment, Harriet knew with absolute certainty that she had found her place in the world not in spite of her silence, but with someone who understood that sometimes the deepest connections form in the spaces between words. The years that followed brought changes both expected and surprising. The house grew along with their family, first a son, Gabriel, born a year after their wedding, then twin daughters, Emma and Sarah, 2 years later. Each child seemed to inherit different aspects of their parents. Gabriel had his father's height and easy charm, Emma, her mother's artistic sensibility, Sarah, a blend of them both, thoughtful but sociable. To everyone's surprise, including her own, Harriet found her voice emerging more frequently after the children were born. It was never entirely comfortable. She still preferred writing for complex thoughts or difficult conversations, but the maternal instinct to communicate with her children seemed to override her lifelong reticence. Zach delighted in these developments, but never pressured her. He remained true to his promise, speaking for them both when needed, understanding her silences, reading the words she wrote with the same attention he gave to spoken conversation. The ranch prospered under their joint care. Zach's knowledge of cattle and Harriet's head for figures proved a formidable combination. Within a decade, they had expanded their holdings, adding adjacent parcels of land as they became available and increasing their herd to respectable size. Harriet found other ways to contribute as well. Her skill with needle and thread, honed during her time at the millinery shop, led to a small side business creating fine clothing and linens that were sought after throughout the county. Eventually, she opened a small shop in town, operating it 2 days a week while the children were in school. Aunt Martha lived to see her great-nieces and nephew grow into teenagers before peacefully passing in her sleep one winter night. She left the millinery shop to Harriet, who eventually sold it to a young woman from Denver with dreams similar to her own. Through all the seasons of their lives, the harsh winters and bountiful springs, the difficulties and triumphs, the everyday moments that make up a marriage, Zach and Harriet's connection only deepened. The understanding that had begun beside a rain barrel on a dusty street grew into something rare and precious. On their 25th wedding anniversary, their children, now adults with lives of their own, arranged a celebration that brought together friends and family from near and far. As the sun set over the land they had nurtured together, Zach led Harriet away from the gathering to the creek that had given their town its name. "Remember the first time I brought you here?" he asked, his hair now streaked with silver but his eyes still the same storm blue that had captured her heart. Harriet nodded, leaning against his shoulder as they watched the water catch the last golden rays of sunlight. "I knew then," he said softly. "Sitting here with you, listening to the creek whisper, I knew you were the one I'd been waiting for my whole life." "So did I," she replied, her voice quiet but clear, no longer the struggle it had once been. Zach turned to face her, taking both her hands in his as he had at their wedding. 25 years, and I've never regretted a single day. You've given me everything I could have wanted: a family, a home, a purpose. You gave me a voice," she said simply. "Even before I found my own," he smiled, the familiar expression still making her heart skip after all these years. "We gave each other what we needed most. That's what love does, I reckon." As twilight settled around them and the first stars appeared overhead, they made their way back to the house they had built together, not just the physical structure, but the life within it. Behind them, the creek continued its eternal whispering, telling stories of a shy Eastern girl, a patient cowboy, and the love that had grown between them, a love expressed in words spoken and unspoken, in silences as eloquent as any declaration. And if anyone in Whispering Creek still occasionally referred to Martha's silent niece, it was with affection rather than judgment, a reminder of how far Harriet had come from the frightened young woman hiding behind a rain barrel. She would never be talkative by nature, but she had found her voice in the ways that mattered most. In the guidance she gave her children, the wisdom she shared with friends, the love she expressed to her husband. As for Zach, he had kept his promise from that very first day. When words failed her, he spoke for them both, but more importantly, he had created a space where her silence was understood as its own kind of eloquence. In doing so, he had given her the greatest gift possible: the freedom to be exactly who she was, neither more nor less, and to be loved completely for it. In the end, theirs was not a story about a woman who learned to speak, but about two people who learned to listen to the whispers of a creek, to the language of gesture and touch, to the quiet spaces between words where the deepest truths often reside. And in that listening, they had found everything they needed to build a life of extraordinary happiness together.